The fastest way to lose everything is to tell the wrong rich man the truth in front of a room full of people. The dinner rush had turned the restaurant into a living machine of clinking glasses, polished smiles and forced patience. Warm amber light spilled from hanging fixtures above the dining room, making every table look more elegant than it really was. Elena Bennett moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, balancing a tray loaded with sparkling water and iced tea while the sounds of conversation rose and fell around her like ocean waves. 26 years old and working double shifts 6 days a week, she had learned how to ignore sore feet, rude customers, and the constant pressure of wondering whether next month's rent would somehow be higher than the last. The restaurant sat in downtown Chicago, surrounded by glass towers that reflected the city lights like mirrors. Wealthy executives filled the dining room every night. Most treated the staff as if they were invisible. Elena had grown used to that. What she never got used to was cruelty. At exactly 8:17 p.m., a black SUV rolled to a stop outside the front entrance. Several guests turned toward the windows. A man stepped out wearing a dark overcoat despite the mild spring weather. Tall, broad shoulders, calm, the kind of presence that made people move without being asked. What Elena didn't know was that half the room recognized him immediately. Gabriel Romano rarely appeared in public without making an impression. Tonight, however, he wasn't looking for attention. He was meeting investors in a private dining room upstairs. Unfortunately for Elena, his arrival happened minutes before her worst night began. Table 14 had already complained twice. A group of wealthy guests celebrating a business acquisition occupied the corner booth near the wine display. The loudest among them was a man named Preston Calloway. Expensive watch, expensive suit, expensive attitude. Elena approached with a professional smile. "Can I get anyone dessert menus?" Preston barely looked at her. He laughed at something one of his friends said before finally turning in her direction. His smile wasn't friendly, it was dismissive. "Actually," he said loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear, "maybe you can explain why service here keeps getting worse every year." Several people chuckled. Elena kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry if something wasn't satisfactory. I'd be happy to help." Preston leaned back in his chair. "You know what's funny? Places keep lowering standards and then acting surprised when customers complain." The comment drew more laughter. Elena recognized the game immediately. Some customers wanted solutions, others wanted an audience. She set the dessert menus down carefully. "If there's an issue with your order, I'd be happy to speak with the kitchen. The issue isn't the food." He looked her up and down briefly before shrugging. "The issue is competence." The laughter grew louder. Elena felt heat climb into her face but remained silent. Across the room, the restaurant manager noticed the interaction and immediately looked away, not because he missed it, because he didn't want to deal with it. Preston seemed encouraged by the lack of resistance. "Tell me something," he continued. "Do they train you to ignore customers, or does that come naturally?" Elena's fingers tightened around her order pad. Around her, conversations slowed. Nearby diners pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller, louder, warmer, the kind of moment that stretched longer than it should. She could have walked away. She could have apologized for something she hadn't done. She could have followed the unwritten rule that people with money were always right. Instead, she looked directly at him. "Respectfully, sir," she said calmly, "being wealthy doesn't make treating people poorly acceptable." The smile vanished from Preston's face. The table fell silent. Somewhere near the entrance, a glass stopped halfway to someone's lips. Elena immediately realized she had crossed an invisible line. "Excuse me?" The air between them changed. Every instinct told her trouble was coming. What she didn't know was that from the second-floor balcony overlooking the dining room, Gabriel Romano had just heard every word, and for the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the building wasn't paying attention to his investors anymore. Preston Calloway stared at Elena as if nobody had ever challenged him before. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade beneath the soft hum of overhead lights and the distant clink of silverware. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Elena could feel dozens of eyes drifting toward table 14, some curious, some uncomfortable, most pretending not to watch. Preston slowly leaned back in his chair and laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can speak to customers like that?" he asked. Elena kept her posture straight. Her pulse was racing, but her voice remained calm. "I think everyone deserves basic respect." A few people nearby exchanged glances. Preston's smile disappeared completely. He reached for the check folder on the table and tossed it onto the polished wood surface. "Get your manager." The The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Across the dining room, the manager was already moving. Thomas Grady arrived less than 30 seconds later, his face carrying the strained expression of a man who cared more about complaints than fairness. "Is there a problem, Mr. Calloway?" Preston stood and adjusted his jacket. "Your waitress insulted me in front of my guests." Elena opened her mouth to explain, but Thomas raised a hand without even looking at her. "I am very sorry, sir." The immediate apology hit harder than she expected, not because it surprised her, because it did not. Preston glanced toward Elena. "You should be." Then he picked up his coat and walked toward the exit with his party trailing behind him. The entire dining room seemed to exhale at once. Conversations slowly resumed, chairs shifted, glasses lifted, the machine of the evening started moving again, but Elena knew her night was far from over. "Office now," Thomas said quietly. The hallway behind the kitchen felt colder than usual. Stainless steel counters reflected harsh white light. Cooks moved around them carrying trays and orders, avoiding eye contact. Nobody needed an explanation. They had all seen enough. Elena followed Thomas into the small office near the employee lockers. The door clicked shut behind them. Rain tapped softly against the narrow window overlooking the alley. Thomas dropped into his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Do you have any idea who that was?" Elena folded her arms. "A customer. That was Preston Calloway." Thomas let out a long breath. "You embarrassed one of our biggest clients." He embarrassed himself. The manager's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he stared at the paperwork scattered across his folder. Elena recognized it immediately. Employee records. Her stomach sank. "Thomas, I do not have a choice." The words sounded rehearsed, like he had already made this decision before walking into the room. "You always have a choice," Elena said quietly. The manager looked away. Outside the office window, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the city skyline. The light briefly illuminated rows of stacked supply boxes. "Human resources will process everything tomorrow." He slid a document across the desk. "Tonight is your last shift." Elena stared at the paper without touching it. 3 years. 3 years of double shifts. Holidays, weekends, and covering for co-workers who called out. 6. Reduced to a single sheet of paper, the silence stretched between them. Eventually, she nodded once, not because she agreed, because there was nothing left to say. 10 minutes later, she stood alone beside her locker. The sounds of the restaurant continued beyond the wall as though nothing had happened. She placed a spare apron, a water bottle, and a framed photo of her parents into a cardboard box. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. Life moved except the person losing something. What Elena did not know was that 2 floors above her, a private meeting had ended early. Gabriel Romano stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. His investors had been discussing numbers for nearly an hour, but his attention had drifted elsewhere. He had watched enough to know exactly what happened downstairs. Beside him stood his longtime advisor, Michael Torres. "You are leaving?" Michael asked. Gabriel adjusted the cuff of his coat. "I am. The investors will not like that." Gabriel looked toward the rain sliding down the glass. "They will survive." Less than 15 minutes later, Elena stepped out the back entrance carrying the box of her belongings. Cold rain greeted her immediately. Water shimmered beneath the alley lights. The city felt larger than usual, lonelier. She stood there for a moment, staring at the cardboard box in her hands and wondering how quickly a normal life could unravel. Then headlights appeared at the far end of the alley. A black sedan rolled silently through the rain before stopping a few yards away. The rear passenger door opened by itself, and for the second time that night, Elena realized her life was about to change. Rain drummed softly against the roof of the black sedan as Elena stood frozen beside the open door. Water ran down the sides of the cardboard box in her arms, darkening the edges. For a moment she wondered if this was some kind of mistake. The alley was nearly empty. The city noise felt distant. Then a man stepped from the front passenger seat holding a large umbrella. He wore a charcoal suit and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Bennett?" he asked. Elena tightened her grip on the box. "Who is asking?" The man offered a polite nod. "Someone who would like to speak with you." Every warning instinct she possessed immediately came alive. Less than an hour ago, she had lost her job. Now, a stranger was waiting for her in a luxury sedan behind the restaurant. None of this felt normal. "I think I will pass," she replied. The man seemed unsurprised. "You are free to do that." He glanced toward the open rear door. "But before you decide, you should know that Mr. Romano rarely asks twice." Elena frowned. The name meant nothing to her. Who is Mr. Romano? The man hesitated briefly as though deciding how much to reveal. The owner. Elena blinked. Owner of what? Several things. The answer somehow raised more questions than it solved. Rain continued to fall around them. Headlights reflected across the wet pavement like liquid gold. Elena looked toward the sedan again. Through the tinted rear window she could barely make out a figure seated inside. Calm, motionless, watching. What she did not know was that Gabriel Romano had already spent the last 15 minutes reviewing her employment file. He knew her age. He knew how long she had worked at the restaurant. He knew every performance review she had ever received. More importantly, he knew she had never once received a customer complaint until tonight. 5 minutes, the man said. That is all he is asking. Elena considered walking away. She could call a rideshare. She could go home and spend the night worrying about bills and job applications. She could pretend none of this had happened. Instead, she surprised herself. 5 minutes, she said. The man nodded and stepped aside. Elena carefully climbed into the vehicle. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Soft lighting illuminated the spacious cabin. Across from her sat the same man she had briefly noticed entering the restaurant earlier that evening. Up close he appeared even more composed. Dark overcoat, sharp features, steady eyes that seemed to notice everything. Gabriel Romano closed a folder resting on his lap. Miss Bennett. Elena shifted the box onto the seat beside her. You know my name. I know quite a bit more than that. The statement should have sounded threatening. Somehow it did not. Then you already know I am having a terrible night. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. I am aware. Silence settled briefly between them. Outside, rain streaked across the windows. Elena could hear traffic moving somewhere beyond the alley. Finally, Gabriel spoke again. You were not wrong. Elena stared at him. Excuse me, what you said to that customer? His voice remained calm. You were not wrong. The simple validation hit harder than she expected. Not because she needed praise, because nobody else had bothered telling the truth. Apparently my manager disagreed. Gabriel glanced toward the rain. Your manager made the easiest decision available to him. And what decision would you have made? She asked. For the first time his expression changed, not dramatically, just enough to reveal something beneath the polished exterior. The correct one. Elena studied him carefully. People with power usually enjoyed reminding others they had it. Gabriel Romano seemed different. That did not mean she trusted, he asked. He reached into the folder and removed a single document. Because I have a job opening. Elena almost laughed. You brought me here to offer a job? Yes, you do not even know me. I know enough. He slid the paper across the seat between them. Elena looked down. Her eyes widened. The position listed was not for a waitress. It was an administrative role within Romano Hospitality Group. Full benefits, higher salary, nearly double what she had been earning. She looked back up immediately. Why? Gabriel held her gaze. Because people who tell the truth when it costs them something are difficult to find. Elena stared at the offer in disbelief. The rain continued falling outside. The city lights blurred against the glass. Somewhere deep inside, a new feeling began replacing the humiliation of the evening. Hope, small, fragile, dangerous. And what neither of them knew yet was that accepting this offer would place Elena directly in the center of a secret someone inside Gabriel's own company was desperately trying to keep buried. The offer remained on Elena's kitchen table long after midnight. The small apartment felt unusually quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional hiss of tires crossing wet pavement outside her window. She had read the document 6 times already. Every number looked real, every signature looked real. Yet nothing about the evening felt real. Less than 4 hours earlier, she had walked out of a restaurant carrying a cardboard box and wondering how she would pay next month's rent. Now she was staring at an opportunity that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. By sunrise, she still had not decided whether to trust it. The next morning arrived wrapped in grey clouds and cold spring air. Elena stepped out of a rideshare and stopped at the edge of a city block dominated by glass and steel. Romano Hospitality Group occupied of a 40-story building overlooking the Chicago River. Sunlight reflected across the windows like sheets of silver. People in tailored suits moved through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Elena looked down at her borrowed blazer and quietly wondered whether she belonged there. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh flowers. A receptionist greeted her immediately. Mrs. Bennett, welcome. We have been expecting you. The words felt strange. Nobody important had ever expected her before. Moments later, she was escorted toward a private elevator. Employees passing through the lobby offered polite smiles. Some recognized her name from the morning memo announcing her arrival. Others simply noticed the unusual attention being given to a new hire. What Elena did not know was that rumors had already begun spreading through several departments. People were asking the same question. Why had Gabriel Romano personally approved the hiring of someone with no corporate experience? The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. The atmosphere changed instantly. The noise of the city disappeared behind thick glass. Soft lighting illuminated elegant hallways lined with artwork and dark wood panels. Elena followed her guide through the corridor until they reached a spacious office overlooking the river. Gabriel Romano stood near the window, speaking quietly with another executive. Good morning, Miss Bennett. Elena felt slightly more prepared than she had the night before, but only slightly. Good morning. Gabriel dismissed the other executive with a nod. Once they were alone, silence settled briefly between them. The city stretched beyond the glass behind him. Boats moved slowly across the water below. Elena noticed that everything in the office seemed organized with almost impossible precision. Nothing appeared accidental. You accepted the offer, Gabriel said. I am still deciding if that was a smart decision. He gestured toward a chair. Elena sat carefully. Gabriel remained standing. You will be assisting several departments initially: administration, operations, internal communications. Elena glanced at the folder waiting on the desk. That sounds like a lot for someone who was carrying food trays yesterday. You learn quickly. You seem very confident about that. Gabriel looked toward the skyline. Confidence and observation are not the same thing. The answer lingered in her mind. Before she could respond, a knock interrupted them. A woman in her 40s entered carrying additional paperwork. Her nameplate identified her as Sandra Whitmore. Her smile appeared professional, but something about it felt strained. Mr. Romano, she said, the quarterly reports are ready. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Elena. For a fraction of a second, surprise crossed her face. Then it disappeared. Mrs. Bennett, nice to meet you, Elena replied. Sandra nodded politely and placed the reports on Gabriel's desk. As she turned to leave, a single folder slipped from the stack and landed on the floor, papers scattered across the polished wood. Sandra reacted immediately, too quickly. She gathered the documents before Elena could help, yet one page remained visible for less than a second. Long enough for Elena to notice something unusual: a list of employee names, several marked inactive. One marked terminated, another marked unavailable. The wording felt strange. Sandra collected the final page and left the office without explanation. Gabriel resumed the conversation as if nothing had happened. But Elena found herself thinking about that list. Hours later, while settling into her new workspace, she passed a row of framed employee recognition photos. Something stopped her cold. One of the women smiling from an older photograph looked familiar. Not because Elena knew her personally. Because she had seen the same name on Sandra's dropped document. The employee had received an award less than a year earlier, yet according to the report she no longer existed anywhere in the company's active records. And for the first time since arriving, Elena began wondering whether the opportunity she had accepted might be connected to something much larger than a single unfair firing. The photograph stayed in Elena's mind for the rest of the afternoon. She tried focusing on orientation materials, company procedures, and the endless stream of emails appearing in her new inbox, but every few minutes her thoughts drifted back to the smiling woman in the employee recognition frame. The name had matched perfectly. The face had matched perfectly, yet according to the document she had glimpsed on Sandra Whitmore's floor, the employee's status no longer seemed to exist in any ordinary category. By 5 o'clock, curiosity had become impossible to ignore. The executive floor had gradually emptied as employees headed home. Outside the windows, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath streaks of orange and gold from the setting sun. Elena remained at her desk, pretending to organize training materials while quietly studying the internal employee directory. The company database contained thousands of names spread across hotels, restaurants, and corporate offices throughout the country. Finding one person should have been easy. Instead, every search returned the same result. No active record found, no archived record found, no transfer record found. It was as if the woman had never worked there at all. Elena leaned back in her chair. Employee recognition awards required approvals, payroll records, and performance reviews. People did not simply disappear from systems that large. At that exact moment, less than 50 feet away, Gabriel Romano was finishing a conference call in his office. Through the glass walls separating departments, he noticed the faint glow of a computer screen still active in an area that should have been empty. Most executives would not have paid attention. Gabriel always did. 10 minutes later, Elena heard footsteps approaching. She quickly minimized the directory search. When she looked up, Gabriel stood beside her desk holding a coffee cup. "You are still here." Elena tried to sound casual. "Trying to learn the system." Gabriel glanced at the monitor. The system is not very exciting. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite serious. He set the coffee on her desk. "You looked like you needed this." Elena stared at the cup. "Most bosses do not bring coffee to employees. Most employees do not stay late on their second day." For a moment neither spoke. The city lights reflected across the glass behind them. Traffic moved like ribbons of white and red far below. The building felt different at night. Quieter. More honest somehow. Elena finally said. Gabriel nodded. "Why did you really hire me?" The question hung between them. He could have given a corporate answer. He could have mentioned potential or work ethic. Instead, he remained silent for several seconds. "Because people reveal who they are when there is a cost attached," he said. "Most choose comfort. You did not." Elena looked down at the coffee cup. Nobody had ever described her that way before. "It still seems like a risk. Everything valuable is." Before she could respond, a voice echoed from farther down the hallway. Sandra Whitmore emerged from a conference room carrying a stack of folders. The moment she noticed Elena and Gabriel speaking, her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I did not realize anyone was still here," she said. Gabriel turned toward her. "Neither did I." Sandra offered a polite smile. "I was finishing quarterly audits." As she adjusted the folders in her arms, one thin file slipped loose and landed near Elena's desk. Sandra reacted immediately, bending to retrieve it, but not before Elena caught another glimpse of a familiar name, the same woman from the photograph. This time there was an additional note printed beside it. "Confidential review." Sandra closed the folder quickly, too quickly. "Good evening," she said before turning and walking away. Elena watched her disappear around the corner. Something about the encounter felt wrong, not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. Gabriel remained quiet. His eyes followed Sandra's departure for a fraction longer than expected. Then he looked back at Elena. "Go home." That sounded like an order, a recommendation. He paused. "Tomorrow will be busy." Elena gathered her things and headed toward the elevators. Yet as the doors closed, she could not stop thinking about the confidential file, the missing employee, and Sandra's nervous reaction. What she did not know was that later that night, after nearly everyone had left the building, someone entered the employee record system using executive credentials. Less than 3 minutes later, several digital files connected to a former employee were permanently deleted, and by the time Elena returned to work the next morning, the first real clue had already vanished. The following morning arrived bright and unusually clear, the kind of Chicago morning that made the river sparkle between towers of glass and steel. Elena stepped into Romano Hospitality headquarters carrying a cup of coffee and a growing sense that something inside the company was not what it appeared to be. The lobby buzzed with activity. Executives crossed polished floors with tablets in hand. Assistants hurried between elevators. Everything looked normal. That was what bothered her most. The stranger a mystery became, the more ordinary it often looked from the outside. By 9 o'clock she was seated at her workstation reviewing internal reports assigned by Human Resources. Most involved routine employee transfers, departmental budgets and training schedules. Nothing unusual. Nothing connected to the missing woman from the photograph. Yet the memory refused to leave her alone. During a short break, Elena opened the employee directory again. She entered the name one more time. No results. She tried variations. Still nothing. Then she searched the Recognition Award database. This time a single archived entry appeared before disappearing almost instantly. Elena frowned. She knew she had seen it. The screen refreshed. The record was gone. She tried again. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. Computer systems did not normally erase information while someone was looking at it. At that exact moment, 3 floors above her, an information technology manager received an automated notification that a restricted archive had been accessed. The alert was immediately forwarded to an executive account. Less than a minute later, the notification itself vanished. Elena leaned closer to her monitor. Something was happening, something deliberate. Before she could investigate further, her desk phone rang. "Mr. Romano would like to see you," the receptionist said. 5 minutes later, Elena entered Gabriel's office. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows behind him. The city stretched across the horizon beneath a cloudless sky. He stood beside a conference table, reviewing several contracts. Gabriel looked up. "Lunch." Elena blinked. "Lunch? You have been staring at spreadsheets for 3 hours. You noticed that? You looked unhappy." Elena folded her arms. "That is a dangerous level of observation." For the first time all morning, Gabriel actually smiled. It transformed his face in a way that caught her off guard. Not softer exactly, more human. 30 minutes later, they sat at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. Unlike the expensive places she expected someone like Gabriel to frequent, this one felt relaxed and comfortable. Sunlight reflected across the water outside. Boats drifted slowly beneath nearby bridges. The atmosphere felt almost normal, almost. "You still do not trust me," Gabriel observed after their meals arrived. Elena nearly laughed. "You hired me out of nowhere, brought me into a company I know nothing about, and somehow already know when I skip lunch." "Fair point." She studied him carefully. "Why do I feel like you are investigating something?" The question lingered between them. Gabriel set down his glass. "Why do you ask?" "Because every time I mention something unusual, you already seem to know part of the answer." His expression became thoughtful. "And what unusual thing have you noticed?" Elena hesitated. Something told her to stay quiet. Another part of her was tired of pretending. Employee. Gabriel's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, recognition. "Tell me." So she did. The photograph, the directory search, the disappearing records, Sandra Whitmore's reaction. Gabriel listened without interrupting. When she finished, silence settled over the table. Outside, a tour boat sounded its horn somewhere downriver. Finally, Gabriel leaned back in his chair. "Interesting." Elena stared at him. "That is all you are going to say? For now, you definitely knew something." "I know enough to believe you are asking the right questions." The answer frustrated her, yet it also confirmed something important. She was not imagining things. Whatever she had discovered mattered. As they returned to headquarters later that afternoon, Elena noticed several employees watching them from across the lobby, some curious, some confused. One looked nervous, Sandra Whitmore. Their eyes met for only a second before Sandra quickly looked away and disappeared into a nearby hallway. Elena slowed her pace. Something about that reaction sent a chill through her, because nervous people usually had a reason to be nervous. And before the workday ended, Elena would receive an anonymous message in her company inbox containing only 7 words. "Stop looking for people who disappeared from records." Elena stared at the message for several seconds. The words remained frozen on her screen. "Stop looking for people who disappeared from records." No signature, no company footer, no identifying information. Just 7 words sitting inside her inbox like a whisper from someone standing in a dark room. Around her, the office continued operating as if nothing had happened. Phones rang, printers hummed. Conversations drifted through hallways. Yet suddenly every sound seemed farther away. Elena checked the sender information. The account no longer existed. She tried opening the profile. Error message. She tried forwarding it to herself. The email vanished before the transfer completed. Her stomach tightened. Somebody inside the company knew she had been asking questions. Somebody had access to systems most employees could not touch. What she did not know was that 2 floors above her, Gabriel Romano had received a nearly identical notification from his cybersecurity department less than 5 minutes earlier. An unauthorized message had passed through internal servers using executive-level permissions. That should have been impossible. Gabriel stared at the report in silence. Then he picked up his phone. "Michael," he said, "I need every access log from the last 30 days. Back on the operations floor, Elena forced herself to focus on work. But the message lingered in her thoughts throughout the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, most employees had gone home. The executive floor grew quieter with every passing minute. Elena gathered her things and headed toward the elevator. As the doors opened, she nearly collided with Gabriel. He looked as though he had been searching for her. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. "That depends. Is this another mysterious conversation where you answer questions without actually answering them?" A faint smile appeared. "Possibly." 20 minutes later, they sat inside a private conference room overlooking the river. The city had transformed into a sea of lights beyond the glass. Reflections shimmered across the dark water below. Gabriel placed a tablet on the table between them. "You received a message today." Elena immediately straightened. "How do you know that?" "Because somebody inside my company is becoming careless." The answer caught her off guard. "So you know who sent it?" "Not yet." He paused. "But I know it should not have happened." For several seconds, neither spoke. There was no trace of amusement in his expression tonight. No casual confidence, only focus. You already suspected something was wrong before I arrived. Did you not? She asked. Gabriel looked toward the river. I suspected there were inconsistencies. Sometimes polite words keep people talking. Elena considered that. Then she made a decision. I want to keep looking. Gabriel turned back toward her. You understand that most people would walk away. Most people were not warned to stop asking questions. Something changed in his expression. Respect. Small but unmistakable. The room fell quiet again. Finally, Gabriel reached into a folder beside him and removed a photograph. He slid it across the table. Elena looked down, her breath caught. It was the missing employee, the same woman from the recognition display, the same face she had searched for repeatedly. Her name was Rachel Turner, Gabriel said. Worked for the company for 6 years. Elena looked up immediately slowly. 3 months ago she resigned according to official records. But you do not believe that? No. The answer came without hesitation. Why? Gabriel tapped the photograph. Because 2 weeks before her resignation, she filed a confidential complaint. Elena's pulse quickened. Against who? Gabriel was silent for several seconds. Then he answered. That is the part someone erased. The city lights flickered beyond the glass. Somewhere below, a train crossed a bridge carrying hundreds of strangers through the night. Elena stared at the photograph in her hands. For the first time, the mystery no longer felt theoretical. There was a real person attached to it now, a real name, a real face, a real story that somebody wanted forgotten. What neither of them knew was that less than a mile away, another former employee sat alone inside a small apartment, staring at an old company identification badge. Her name had also been removed from the records, and tomorrow morning she was finally going to answer a phone call she had been avoiding for months. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of low-grey clouds that turned the Chicago skyline into a watercolor painting of steel and glass. Elena barely touched her coffee during the drive to work. Rachel Turner's photograph remained vivid in her mind. The missing records, the anonymous warning, the erased complaint, none of it felt like coincidence anymore. By 8:30 she was seated at her desk, staring at her inbox when a message from Gabriel appeared. Conference room 12. 9 a.m. sharp. No additional explanation. 25 minutes later she stepped into a quiet conference room overlooking the river. Gabriel was already there, so was Michael Torres. A tablet rested on the polished table between them. Someone called this morning, Michael said. He tapped the screen. A woman appeared in a grainy video thumbnail. Early 30s, blonde hair, nervous eyes. Who is she? Elena asked. Former employee, Gabriel replied. Another one whose records were removed. Elena felt a chill move through her. She agreed to talk? For the first time, the video began. The woman sat inside a small apartment with drawn curtains behind her. Her hands remained clasped tightly together. My name is Lauren Hayes, she said quietly. I worked for Romano Hospitality for 4 years. She paused before continuing. Rachel Turner was my friend. Elena exchanged a glance with Gabriel. The room seemed to grow quieter. Lauren explained that several employees had raised concerns about workplace conduct months earlier. Nothing criminal, nothing sensational, but repeated complaints involving favoritism, intimidation, and pressure placed on female employees who refused certain requests from senior management. Every report had disappeared, every complaint had been closed, every employee involved eventually left the company. Rachel refused to stay silent, Lauren said. She kept copies of everything. Michael stopped the recording. There is more. The second half of the interview revealed something even stranger. 2 weeks before Rachel vanished from company records, she scheduled a meeting with someone from executive leadership. A meeting that never appeared in official calendars. Do we know who? Elena asked. Gabriel's expression darkened slightly. Not yet. The answer frustrated her. Yet for the first time they had something real, a witness, a pattern, evidence that Rachel had not simply resigned and disappeared. As the meeting ended, Elena remained seated. Her eyes drifted toward the city beyond the glass. Why would someone go this far? She asked quietly. Gabriel stood beside the window. Because secrets become expensive when enough people know them. The rest of the day moved quickly. Elena assisted multiple departments while secretly reviewing archived employee communications. Most revealed nothing useful. But shortly after lunch she discovered something unusual. An internal newsletter from 7 months earlier contained a photograph from a charity gala hosted by the company. Hundreds of employees attended. Executives smiled beneath crystal chandeliers. Guests filled a ballroom decorated in gold and silver. Rachel Turner appeared near the edge of one photograph. Standing beside her was Sandra Whitmore, Elena enlarged the image. Sandra looked uncomfortable. Rachel looked determined. It was impossible to explain why, but the photograph felt important. At that exact moment, several floors above, Sandra Whitmore was standing alone in her office. Rain had begun tapping softly against her windows. She stared at an old storage box pulled from the back of a locked cabinet. Inside sat employee files that should have been destroyed months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the lid, because for the first time in a very long time, Sandra was beginning to fear that the truth might actually surface. Late that afternoon, Elena carried the gala photograph to Gabriel's office. He studied it carefully. Then his eyes narrowed. "Look here," he said. Elena stepped closer. Gabriel pointed toward a reflection visible in one of the ballroom mirrors. It was subtle, easy to miss. Yet once she saw it, she could not unsee it. Rachel was holding a folder with a bright red label identical to the confidential review files Sandra had been hiding. Neither spoke for several seconds. The implication settled heavily between them. Evidence connected to employee complaints, evidence someone desperately wanted erased. Then Gabriel's phone rang. He listened silently for nearly 30 seconds before ending the call. "What happened?" Elena asked. Gabriel looked directly at her. "We found Lauren Hayes." Relief immediately crossed Elena's face. "That is good news." Gabriel remained silent. "Is it not?" For the first time all day, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "She agreed to meet in person tonight." He paused. "And she says she knows exactly whose name was inside Rachel Turner's missing complaint." Rain swept across the city by the time Gabriel's car turned onto a quiet side street near the north edge of downtown. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement in long ribbons of gold and white. Elena sat beside the window, watching unfamiliar buildings pass by while questions crowded her thoughts. The name inside Rachel Turner's complaint had become the center of everything. Every erased record, every warning, every missing file seemed connected to that single answer. 20 minutes later, the car stopped outside a small coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a florist. Most of the businesses on the block had already closed for the evening. Only a few lights remained visible through rain-speckled glass. Lauren Hayes sat alone near the back corner when Elena and Gabriel entered. She looked exactly like the woman from the video call, nervous shoulders, a half-finished cup of coffee resting untouched beside her. The moment she saw Gabriel, she visibly relaxed. The moment she saw Elena, curiosity crossed her face. "You brought her," Lauren said quietly. Gabriel pulled out a chair. "She earned her place here." Elena noticed Lauren studying her for several seconds before nodding. "Then she deserves to know what Rachel found." Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the coffee shop remained nearly empty. A low jazz melody drifted from hidden speakers overhead. The setting felt strangely peaceful for a conversation carrying so much weight. Lauren reached into her purse and removed a small flash drive. She placed it on the table between them. Rachel made copies. Gabriel's attention immediately sharpened. Copies of what? Law internal complaints, human resources reviews, executive communications. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Against who? Lauren looked directly at Gabriel. Not one person. The answer caught all of them off guard. "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Lauren folded her hands together. Every complaint passed through the same approval chain before disappearing. Every complaint. Silence settled over the table. The answer was somehow worse than expected. A single corrupt employee would have been simple. This suggested something larger, more organized, more protected. Gabriel leaned forward slightly. "Names." Lauren nodded. Sandra Whitmore was involved. Elena felt a chill run through her. The confirmation was not surprising anymore, yet hearing it aloud made everything feel real. Lauren continued, "But Rachel believed Sandra was covering for someone higher." Gabriel's expression remained unreadable. "How much higher?" Lauren hesitated. "Senior" outside seemed louder now. Elena exchanged a glance with Gabriel. Neither needed to say what they were thinking. Somebody near the top of the company structure had been protecting complaints from scrutiny. Somebody with enough authority to alter records and silence investigations. Lauren pushed the flash drive toward them. Rachel planned to bring everything directly to the board. Elena stared at the device, such a small object, yet it suddenly felt heavier than anything sitting on the table. Did she ever get the chance? Lauren slowly shook her head. No. The answer lingered painfully in the air. Gabriel finally reached for the drive. "Why keep this hidden?" Lauren looked toward the rain-covered window. "Because I was scared." Her voice softened. "And because Rachel told me if anything happened, I should wait until I found someone who actually cared about the truth." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Elena found herself looking at Lauren differently now, not as a witness, not as a source, as someone who had spent months carrying a burden alone. Eventually Gabriel stood. "You did the right thing." Lauren offered a faint smile. The first genuine smile Elena had seen from her all evening. An hour later they returned to headquarters. Most of the building sat dark and empty. Only a handful of executive offices remained illuminated against the night skyline. Elena followed Gabriel into a secure conference room where Michael Torres was already waiting. The flash drive was connected to a laptop within minutes. Hundreds of files appeared on the screen. Complaint forms, archived emails, meeting notes, internal investigations that had supposedly never existed. Elena watched as Michael opened document after document. Every file pointed toward the same conclusion. Sandra Whitmore had approved the suppression of complaints repeatedly. Yet another name appeared beside hers over and over again, a name Elena had never seen before. Gabriel stared at the screen, his expression hardened. Michael looked equally stunned. Elena leaned closer. "Who is that?" Gabriel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor. Finally he spoke, the head of corporate compliance. Elena felt her stomach drop, because if the person responsible for enforcing company ethics had been helping bury complaints all along, then the corruption was far deeper than any of them had imagined. And hidden within the final folder on the flash drive was a document dated 2 days before Rachel Turner disappeared from company records. A document containing a meeting invitation addressed directly to someone sitting on Romano Hospitality's executive board. The conference room remained silent except for the faint hum of the laptop and the distant sound of rain striking the windows 30 floors above the city. Elena stared at the meeting invitation on the screen. The timestamp was clear, the recipient was clear. Nothing about it looked accidental. Michael opened the attached metadata while Gabriel remained standing behind him with his arms folded across his chest. The atmosphere had changed completely. Hours earlier they had been searching for clues. Now they were staring at proof that the problem reached far higher than anyone had expected. "Open the board records," Gabriel said. Michael nodded and pulled up another file. Names appeared one by one, executives, advisors, directors. Elena watched carefully as the information loaded. Then Michael stopped. The same name from Rachel Turner's meeting invitation appeared again. Harold Kensington, member of the executive board, head of corporate oversight committee, responsible for reviewing ethics concerns across the entire company. Elena felt disbelief settle over her. The person assigned to protect employees was the same person reviewing complaints? Michael looked grim. Not just reviewing them, approving final outcomes. Gabriel said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him, casting long shadows through the room. Elena suddenly understood why Rachel's records had vanished, why complaints had disappeared, why employees had quietly left without answers. Every road led back to someone powerful enough to control the process itself. Michael opened another folder recovered from the flash drive. Inside sat dozens of emails. Most were routine, some were heavily redacted, but one message immediately drew attention, sent from Sandra Whitmore to Harold Kensington 7 months earlier. Subject line, Rachel Turner escalation. Michael clicked it open. The message was brief. "Rachel is refusing the settlement package. She says she intends to present supporting documentation directly to leadership. Please advise." Elena felt her pulse quicken. Michael scrolled further. A response appeared beneath it. "Do not schedule additional meetings. I will handle it personally." The room grew still. Nobody needed to interpret what they were seeing anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. Gabriel finally moved toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass behind him. For several moments he remained silent. Elena had known him only a short time, but she could tell something deeper was happening beneath his calm exterior. This was not simply a corporate problem. This was a betrayal inside his own organization. "How long has he been on the board?" Elena asked quietly. "Trusted by investors, trusted by regulators, trusted by everyone." Gabriel turned slowly. "Not anymore." The certainty in his voice sent a chill through the room. For the first time since this investigation began, Elena saw anger. Not loud anger, not reckless anger, something colder, more controlled. The kind that came from discovering someone had abused a position of trust. Michael continued reviewing files. One document after another strengthened the pattern. Complaints routed through specific channels, investigations closed without explanation, employees pressured into signing resignation agreements. Nothing illegal on the surface, everything designed to appear legitimate. That was what made it so dangerous. It hid behind paperwork. behind professional language. Then Michael froze. There is more. He opened the final encrypted folder recovered from Rachel's archive. Inside sat a scanned memorandum signed by multiple executives. Most names were irrelevant, one was not. Harold Kensington's signature appeared at the bottom beside approval authorization codes. Attached was a list of employee cases. Rachel Turner's name appeared at the top. Elena leaned closer. A handwritten note sat in the margin. 4 simple words. Removed before board review. Nobody spoke. The evidence was now undeniable. Rachel had been telling the truth. Lauren had been telling the truth. The missing employees had been telling the truth. Gabriel returned to the table and picked up the memorandum. For several seconds he studied the document in silence. Then he placed it back down carefully. "Prepare everything," he said. Michael looked up. "Everything? Every file, every email, every complaint?" Michael nodded immediately. Elena watched the exchange and realized something important. The investigation was no longer about discovering the truth. They already had it. The next step would be proving it publicly. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. The storm intensified beyond the windows, and somewhere else inside the building, Sandra Whitmore sat alone in her office staring at her phone as an incoming message appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence: "They found Rachel's files." The storm had passed by morning, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale blue sky. Sunlight reflected from glass towers across downtown Chicago, but inside Romano Hospitality headquarters the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Elena stepped off the elevator and immediately sensed the difference. Conversations stopped when she approached. Executives moved through hallways with unusual urgency. Closed office doors remained closed. News traveled fast in large organizations, and although nobody knew the full story yet, people could feel something shifting beneath the surface. On the executive floor, Gabriel's conference room had become the center of that shift. By 9 o'clock, legal advisors, compliance specialists, and independent auditors occupied nearly every seat around the long table. Folders covered every available surface. Laptops displayed timelines, communication logs, and complaint records recovered from Rachel Turner's archive. Elena sat quietly near the end of the table watching the process unfold. For the first time she could see the full scale of what Rachel had uncovered. It was bigger than a single complaint, bigger than a single employee. Over the course of several years, dozens of reports had followed the same pattern. Employees raised concerns, reviews were initiated, files were redirected, cases disappeared, careers quietly ended. Everything had been hidden beneath layers of procedure that appeared legitimate on paper. Gabriel stood at the front of the room, reviewing the findings with calm precision, yet Elena noticed something different about him today. The distance she had first associated with him seemed gone. What remained was focus, determination, responsibility. He was no longer investigating a problem inside his company. He was confronting one. Around noon, the final piece arrived. Michael Torres entered carrying a sealed folder from the independent auditors. The room immediately fell silent. Michael placed the folder in front of Gabriel. "Verification is complete." Nobody spoke. Gabriel opened the file slowly. Elena watched his eyes scan the pages. Then he handed the report to the lead attorney. The attorney reviewed it before nodding once. "It is confirmed." A wave of silence moved through the room. Every recovered email, every deleted complaint, every authorization code. The entire chain had been independently verified. The evidence was now impossible to dismiss. Harold Kensington had approved the suppression of employee complaints repeatedly. Sandra Whitmore had helped facilitate the process. Several others had assisted by altering records and closing investigations prematurely. The facts no longer depended on testimony. They existed in documented form. Elena looked around the room. Some executives appeared shocked, others appeared embarrassed. A few simply looked relieved that the truth had finally surfaced. What she did not expect was what happened next. Gabriel turned toward her. "You should stay." Several people looked surprised. Elena felt equally surprised. "Stay for what?" she asked. "The board meeting." The answer caught her off guard. "I am not a board member." "No," Gabriel replied, "but none of this reaches this point without you." For a moment she did not know what to say. Only weeks earlier she had been serving tables at a restaurant. Now she was being invited into one of the most important meetings in company history. The realization felt almost unreal. The board meeting began at 3 o'clock. Executives filled the room beneath high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. The atmosphere carried the tension of people who already suspected the outcome but had not yet heard it spoken aloud. Harold Kensington sat near the center of the table, impeccably dressed, calm, confident. He greeted colleagues with polite smiles as if nothing had changed. Elena studied him carefully. He looked nothing like the villain she had imagined. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. When the meeting officially started, Gabriel remained standing. No presentation slides, no corporate language, no rehearsed speeches, just facts. One by one, the documents were distributed around the table. Emails, complaints, audit confirmations. Silence gradually replaced confidence as board members turned pages. Harold Kensington's expression shifted for the first time, only slightly, but enough. The evidence was overwhelming. No explanation could erase it. No procedure could hide it anymore. For nearly an hour, the room remained focused entirely on the documents. Questions were asked, answers were given, independent findings were verified. By the end, the truth sat openly in front of everyone. Gabriel finally closed the final folder. "The board will make its decision," he said quietly. No anger, no triumph, just certainty. Across the table, several board members exchanged glances before requesting a private vote. The room slowly emptied. Elena remained seated near the window, staring at the river below. Months of secrets had reached their final moment. Then Michael entered carrying his phone. His expression immediately caught Gabriel's attention. "What is it?" Gabriel asked. Michael looked from him to Elena. He turned the screen toward them. A new message had just arrived from an unknown sender. Attached was a photograph. Rachel Turner standing beside a smiling woman Elena had never seen before. Underneath the image was a single sentence. "There are more victims who never filed complaints." The photograph changed everything, but not in the way Elena first expected. By sunrise the next morning, the unknown sender had identified herself through company counsel. She was not a new victim. She was a former employee who had spent months helping Rachel Turner gather testimony from workers who had been too afraid to file formal complaints. The message was not a warning. It was an act of trust. It was proof that Rachel had never been alone. Sunlight poured across the Chicago River as Elena arrived at headquarters. The building felt different now, lighter, not because the situation had become easier, but because secrets lost power once they were exposed. Inside the executive floor, teams, attorneys, and investigators moved with purpose. Phones rang constantly, documents were reviewed, meetings filled every conference room. Yet beneath all the activity existed a sense of direction that had been missing before. For the first time, everyone was moving toward the truth instead of away from it. Elena found Gabriel standing alone near the windows of his office. The skyline stretched behind him beneath a bright blue sky. He held a folder in one hand but seemed more interested in the river below. "You have been here since dawn," Elena said. Gabriel glanced toward her. "Earlier, that is not healthy." A faint smile appeared. "I have been told that before." The silence between them felt different than it had weeks earlier, easier, familiar. Neither needed to fill every moment with words anymore. "What happens today?" she asked. Gabriel looked back toward the city. "Today we finish it." By noon, the board had completed its final review. Independent auditors delivered their conclusions. Outside investigators verified the recovered evidence. Human Resources reopened every complaint connected to the suppressed cases. One by one, the system that had hidden the truth began correcting itself. Harold Kensington was formally removed from every leadership position. Sandra Whitmore resigned before the final vote concluded. Several others followed. No dramatic confrontations, no public spectacles. Just accountability arriving exactly where it should have arrived years earlier. Elena spent most of the afternoon helping organize employee outreach efforts. Former workers who had disappeared from records were contacted and invited to share their experiences. Support resources were offered. Independent review channels were established, policies were written. The work was not glamorous. It was something better, it was real. Late in the day, a video call connected dozens of former employees from across the country. Some appeared nervous, some emotional, some simply Lauren Hayes. Beside her appeared several people Elena recognized from Rachel's files. Faces that had existed only in documents until now, stories that had nearly been erased. Gabriel addressed them briefly, no corporate language, no carefully crafted public relations statement, just honesty. He acknowledged the failures. He accepted responsibility for fixing them. He promised transparency moving forward. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt meaningful, the kind of silence that appears after a storm finally passes. Evening settled over the city. Golden sunlight painted the skyscrapers in warm shades of amber and bronze. Most employees had already gone home when Elena stepped onto the rooftop terrace overlooking the river. A cool breeze moved through the air. Below, traffic flowed steadily through the streets. She heard footsteps behind her. Gabriel joined her at the railing. For several moments neither spoke. They simply watched the city. Rachel should have seen this, Elena said quietly. Gabriel nodded. She should have. The answer carried no defensiveness, no excuses, only truth. Elena rested her hands on the railing. You know, when I met you, I thought you were probably the most intimidating person I had ever seen. Gabriel laughed softly. Only probably? She smiled. Definitely. The sound of their laughter drifted into the evening air. It faded quickly, leaving something warmer behind. Something neither of them needed to define immediately. Finally, Gabriel looked toward her. You changed this company. Elena shook her head. Rachel started it. Maybe, he paused, but you finished it. For a moment, neither looked away. The city lights slowly began appearing across the skyline as daylight faded into dusk. Somewhere below, the river reflected the first stars of evening, and for the first time since losing her job outside a restaurant in the rain, Elena realized she was no longer carrying that humiliation with her. It was gone, replaced by something stronger. Purpose, respect, hope. What neither of them said aloud was that tomorrow would not be about investigations, complaints, or missing records. Tomorrow would simply be about deciding what came next after the truth had finally won. 3 months later, the rain returned, not the violent storms that rolled across the city during summer, just a steady spring rain drifting through downtown Chicago like a memory refusing to disappear. Elena stood beneath the awning of a familiar building and watched water ripple across the sidewalk. Commuters hurried past carrying umbrellas. Taxi lights reflected against wet pavement. Somewhere nearby, a train horn echoed through the evening air. The city looked almost exactly the same as it had on the night everything changed. Almost. Behind her, the restaurant doors opened and closed as before. New managers worked inside now. New policies, new leadership. The place had survived. So had she. Elena glanced down at her phone and smiled. A message from Lauren Hayes had arrived earlier that afternoon. Another former employee had accepted a new position. Someone else had decided to start over. Small victories continued appearing every week. The investigation had officially concluded months ago. Independent reviews had been completed. Employee protections had been expanded throughout the company. Training programs had been rebuilt from the ground up. Most importantly, the people whose voices had been ignored finally had a place where they could be heard. Rachel Turner's name now appeared inside the company's annual leadership report. Not buried, not forgotten, recognized exactly as it should have been. Elena looked across the street where city lights shimmered through the rain. Sometimes she still thought about the chain of events that brought her here. One moment of honesty, one decision to stand up for herself. One night that seemed like a disaster at the time. Life rarely announced its turning points while they were happening. A black sedan slowly pulled to the curb beside her. Elena laughed softly before the vehicle even stopped completely. Some things never changed. The passenger door opened. Gabriel stepped out holding an umbrella. You are early, Elena said. You are later than I expected. That sounds suspiciously like criticism, observation. He offered his arm. Elena rolled her eyes and accepted it anyway. Together they started walking down the block. Rain tapped softly against the umbrella overhead. The city moved around them in a blur of lights and reflections. Neither felt any need to rush. They had both spent months running toward solutions. Tonight, there was nowhere they needed to be except here. A few blocks later, they reached the Riverwalk. The rain had driven most people indoors, leaving the waterfront unusually quiet. Water shimmered beneath rows of glowing lights stretching into the distance. The skyline reflected across the river like a painting. Elena rested her hands against the railing. Gabriel stood beside her. For several moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned. Do you ever think about that night? Gabriel finally asked. Elena smiled. The night I lost my job? That one. She looked out across the water. Sometimes. Gabriel nodded slowly. So do I. The answer surprised her. Why? He considered the question before answering. Because it reminded me that systems fail when good people stop paying attention. Elena glanced toward him. That sounds like something you practiced in front of a mirror. For the first time all evening, Gabriel laughed. A real laugh. Unrestrained. The sound echoed softly above the river. Elena found herself smiling simply because he was. The moment lingered longer than either expected. Then Gabriel reached into his coat pocket and removed a small folded photograph. He handed it to her. Elena unfolded it carefully. Rachel Turner stood smiling beside several co-workers during an employee volunteer event. The picture had recently been recovered from archived company files. On the back was a handwritten note. People deserve better than silence. Elena read the sentence twice, then a third time. Rain continued falling around them. Soft, steady, peaceful. She was right. Gabriel looked toward the city lights. Yes, the river carried reflections downstream beneath the darkening sky. Cars moved across distant bridges. Life continued forward exactly as it always had, yet somehow everything felt different. Elena carefully folded the photograph and slipped it into her coat pocket, not as a reminder of what had gone wrong, as a reminder of what had finally gone right. The rain grew slightly heavier. Gabriel opened the umbrella wider above them. "You know, the first time I saw you, I thought you were probably the last person in the world I would trust." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Only probably?" She smiled. "Definitely." This time he did not argue. Instead, he simply reached for her hand. She let him. Together they stood overlooking the river while rain drifted across the city and lights shimmered against the water below. Months earlier, she had stood alone in the rain outside a restaurant carrying a cardboard box and wondering what came next. Now she stood beside someone who had chosen truth over convenience, responsibility over comfort, and people over power. The city stretched endlessly before them, not as a place of secrets anymore, as a place of possibilities. And beneath the glow of Chicago's skyline, with rain falling gently around them and the river carrying reflections into the night, the story finally came to rest exactly where it belonged.